whole topic, memory revision. So what do you need to know for the memory topic? We need to know about the features of memory. So that's the coding, capacity and duration of both short-term and long-term memory. The types of long-term memory, so there's 3 types that we need to be aware of. Models of memory, so that's the multi-store model of memory and the working memory model. We need to be aware of explanations of forgetting, so interference, retro and proactive, and retrieval failure due to an absence of cues from the environment or mental cues. We need to be aware of factors affecting eyewitness testimony, so that's misleading information, which can be further broken down into leading questions or post-event discussion, and how anxiety can have a positive or negative effect on accuracy of eyewitness testimony. We need to also be aware of how we can improve the accuracy of eyewitness testimony, so the use of the cognitive interview. So the encoding or coding of short-term and long-term memory was investigated by Badley. It was a long lab experiment where participants had to learn either acoustically similar or dissimilar words or semantically similar or dissimilar words. So acoustically similar, so words that sounded the same, or acoustically dissimilar, words that sounded different. Semantically similar, words that mean the same. Semantically dissimilar, words with a different meaning. Okay? They were asked to recall the words immediately, so to test their short-term memory. Then after 20 minutes they were asked to recall the words again, so testing their long-term memory. It was found that when they had to recall the words immediately, they had difficulty remember the acoustically similar words, and when it was tested in long-term memory they had difficulty remember the semantically similar words. So this suggests that STM is acoustically encoded, whereas LTM is semantically encoded, because they were more difficult to encode semantically in long-term memory. So evaluation of this research study. It was a lab experiment which increases the internal validity of the research due to control of extraneous variables. There are some real-world applications. So if we know that we encode semantically in long-term memory, teachers could develop learning strategies to help improve memory in future, which can in turn lead to an increase in the economy if we are able to retain information for long periods of time. However, low external validity and lacks mundane realism, so it doesn't really explain everyday memory. It's unlikely that we go around learning a list of words every day. We have contradictory research, so STM can use visual codes in encoding, and also LTM, there's been evidence that we can encode visually and acoustically in long-term memory. So the capacity of short-term memory. Jacobs gave participants, they were read either a list of letters or numbers and they had to recall them immediately in the correct order. Okay, so that's serial recall. And this digits increased each time until they were unable to remember the letters or numbers in the correct order. So on average they could recall 9 numbers but only 7 letters, and interesting enough it seemed to increase with age. So 8-year-olds could only recall on average 7 digits, whereas by the age of 19 it had increased to 9. Therefore he concluded that we could remember about 5 to 9 items in our short-term memory. That is our capacity, that's how much we could hold. Okay, we have supporting evidence by Miller, who wrote an article about the magic number, which is 7 plus or minus 2. So he said that our average span was 5 to 9 items in our short-term memory. Again, real-world application, so teachers to know how much pupils students can hold in their short-term memory when presenting information. Cohen said that capacity is even more limited in STM, so only 4 items that we could hold. There are individual differences, so Jacobs found that recall increased with age, so STM is not the same for everyone. And again, it lacks mundane realism and ecological validity. It is a very artificial task that may not explain everyday memories. Okay, let's look at the duration. So duration of STM. This was Peterson and Peterson. So 24 psychology college students were shown a trigram. These were made up of consonants, and they had to count backwards in 3 from a 3-digit number until they were told to stop and then asked to recall the trigram. It was repeated 8 times at different intervals, so at 3 seconds, 6 seconds, 9 seconds, 12, 15 or 18 seconds. So after 3 seconds, 90% of the participants could remember their trigram. By 9 seconds it had dropped to 20%, and after 18 seconds it went down to 2%. So it suggests that our short-term memory is approximately 18 seconds long, so not very long at all. It has high internal validity because it was a lab experiment, but again lacks mundane realism, ecological validity. It was a repeated measures design, so it could be that participants had fatigue effects and that's why their memory decreased or the recall accuracy rate decreased rather than actually measuring the duration. Investigation into LTM and the duration. So this was Barrack et al. Opportunity sample of 392 American ex-high school students. So the time since graduating was between 2 weeks and 57 years. The range of the participants was 17 to 74 years old. So they had 4 conditions. 1, they had free recall, so they just had to name as many participants, as many classmates as possible. A photo recognition test, so they had to identify from 50 photos which were their classmates, only some of them were. 3, they had a name recognition test to identify the names of their ex-classmates. And 4, a name and photo matching, so they had to match the photo with the name. 90% could recognise faces and names after 15 years, and 75% could recognise names and faces after 48 years. So it suggests that LTM is potentially unlimited in its duration. High level of mundane realism, so remembering faces is a task that we do in everyday life. There may have been extraneous variables, so for example some participants may have seen their classmates over the years, which could explain the high accuracy recall. However, familiar faces is a very specific type of information, therefore the results might not generalise to memory of other information. Types of long-term memory. So apparently we have 3 types of long-term memory: episodic, semantic and procedural. Semantic is our long-term memory for knowledge of the world, so facts and our knowledge of what words and concepts mean. Episodic relates to memories of our own personal events, episodes within our life, so memories when events have happened, of the people, objects, places and behaviours that were involved. Procedural, this is to do with skills that we have learnt, so our knowledge of how to do things. We have evidence from case studies, so Clive Waring. His episodic memory, so his memory of his personal information, was severely impaired, but his semantic and procedural memories was relatively unaffected. So Clive could still remember how to play the piano, so that was a skill. His procedural memory was still intact, suggesting that there is different types of long-term memory. Brain imaging, so episodic and semantic, were recalled from our prefrontal cortex, whereas procedural was recalled from the basal ganglia. So the fact that these different types of memories are recalled from different areas of the brain suggests that certain areas of the brain deals with different memories, suggesting that they are different. Episodic memories could be improved in older people who have had a mild cognitive impairment, so it shows that there's real-world application of the research and the benefits of being able to distinguish between the different types of long-term memory. However, the use of clinical populations such as case studies with brain damage is that people with brain injuries lack control over other variables, so we can't really accurately assess the before and afters of them. And contradictory evidence. So apparently Cohen and Squires disregards the fact that there are 3 types of long-term memory. They believe there is 2 long-term memory stores broken down into declarative and non-declarative. Okay, our first model of memory is the multi-store model. Okay, this is a linear model and it describes how information flows or is passed through each of the 3 stores of memory. This is the sensory store, the short-term memory store and the long-term memory store. So the sensory store has a very brief duration, so it's less than half a second long. It deals with encoding based on our senses, so visual, auditory, tactile. However, the capacity seems to be very large. If we fail to pay attention to the information, then it is forgotten, is disregarded. And if we pay attention, then it moves into our short-term memory store. Short-term memory store has a limited capacity and duration. So think back to the models, the features of memory research. So short-term memory is encoded acoustically. It has a limited capacity of 5 to 9 items, so 7 plus or minus 2 by Miller, and it has a limited duration, approximately 18 seconds, according to Peterson and Peterson. So if we rehearse the information repeatedly, it moves from short-term memory to long-term memory. If we fail to rehearse the information, it is decayed, so it's forgotten. It also might become displaced. So sometimes we haven't had chance to rehearse the information enough to transfer to long-term memory, and we have some new information enter our short-term memory. So because of the limited duration and capacity, we can't hold on to both these sets of information, so it is displaced and forgotten about. Long-term memory is our permanent memory store. So when we recall our materials, it has to be transferred back, so retrieval into our short-term memory. So again, use our features of memory research. The capacity seems to be unlimited. Duration seems to be potentially unlimited, so Barrack, the high school students looking at the yearbooks, and it tends to be encoded semantically. Here we can use the case study of HM. So he appeared to have his STM still intact, but his LTM was defective, so it suggests that STM and LTM are separate stores. The recency and primacy effects, so serial recall tasks. So items that are at the end of the list, we are able to recall better. Also, because they're in our short-term memory, also items that were at the start of the list, we tend to be able to recall better because we have had chance to rehearse them and they are in our LTM, whereas words in the middle, we haven't had chance to rehearse and we haven't had chance, and they're not in our short-term memory, so they have decayed, they've been forgotten about. However, there's overemphasis on the features, so rehearsal isn't necessarily always necessary for us to move information to LTM. So sometimes we can remember things that were funny or distinctive, not necessarily that we've rehearsed the information. Generally, most of the research that is backing the information surrounding the encoding capacity and duration of STM and LTM was lab methods and artificial stimulus, so therefore might not reflect everyday memory. Also, it believes that STM and LTM are unitary stores of information. However, working memory model says that STM is broken down into a visual component and a auditory component, and as we discussed earlier, LTM is broken down into 3 different types, so episodic, semantic and procedural, so it's not just a unitary single store. So our second model of memory is the working memory model, and this just focuses on the short-term memory and how it is organised and how it functions. So it's not necessarily offering an explanation of long-term memory or sensory memory, just the short-term memory. It's broken down into different components, so the central executive, the phonological loop, the visuospatial sketch pad, and the episodic buffer. So the central executive is like the controller. So it pays attention and it monitors incoming data and decides which slave system to allocate the task to. However, it has a very limited storage capacity. The phonological loop consists of the phonological store and the articulatory control system. So it deals with auditory information. The phonological store stores the words that you hear, whereas the articulatory control system deals with the maintenance rehearsal, so repeating the sounds to keep them within a working memory model while we need them. Again, it has a very limited capacity, so suggesting that we can't do two tasks that require the same system. So we can't do two auditory tasks at the same time. The visuospatial sketchpad is broken down into the visual cache and the inner scribe. So this deals with both visual information and spatial information. So the visual cache stores our visual data, whereas the inner scribe records the arrangement of objects within our visual field. Again, it has a very limited capacity, therefore we can't do two visual tasks at the same time. However, we should be able to do a visual and an auditory task at the same time because they're both using different slave systems. Then the episodic buffer was added in 2000. So this is the temporary store of information. It integrates both the visual, spatial and verbal information from the other stores. It's linked to LTM and it maintains the time sequencing, so it records the events that are happening at the time. So we have some case study evidence to support that we have both verbal memory and a visual memory. So KF, he had impaired verbal memory, so his phonological loop, but his visual memory was still functioning normally, suggesting they are separate stores of information. PET scans have also revealed that different areas of the brain are used when we do a verbal task compared to what we do when we do a visual task, so that suggests that they are different stores of information. Generally, the evidence from the models mainly comes from case studies with brain injury or brain damage. Therefore, we can't make before and after comparisons. Again, there's been an overuse of lab experiments. So again, it lacks mundane realism or ecological validity. And also much of the information is very vague. So we don't really know much about the capacity of the central executive, and we can't really test the central executive. So moving on to the explanations of forgetting, we have interference. Okay, so interference is when one memory blocks another, so one or both of them becomes distorted or forgotten. We can have proactive interference, is when an old memory interferes with a newer one, or we can have retroactive interference. This is when a new memory interferes with an older one. Remember, the type of interference is named after the memory it is affecting. So pro is affecting new, retro old, new affecting old. Again, the degree in which interference happens is greater if they are similar. So McGosh and MacDonald found that interference was greater when the information was similar. So this was when participants had to learn different sets of words, and when they had words that were synonyms, there was greater interference than when they learned a list of unrelated words. So lab experiments. So McGosh and MacDonald was a lab experiment. We can have that control over extraneous variables, so we can have confidence that interference is a valid explanation. Real life studies, so this was the rugby player study, so they had to try and remember the names of the teams that they'd played so far in the season, week by week. So accurate recall depended on the number of games that they had played in the meantime. So a player recall of a team from 3 weeks ago was much better if they'd played no matches in between. So it wasn't necessarily the amount of time in between the recall, but the amount of games that they had played. So the new games had interfered with the older memory. Generally, most of the studies have used artificial materials, so using lists of words may not reflect everyday memory. There's been too much of an overemphasis on interference, so both memories need to be really quite similar for it to have an explanation. Also, it was found that when you're tested 24 hours, you have regained the memory. So there's been recovery. So interference doesn't seem to be that accurate. So it's been purely that they're not accessible for the amount of time, not that they have been lost. The other explanation is the retrieval failure. So this happens because we do not have cues to aid our memory. The encoding specificity principle, so if a cue is present at the time of recall and present at the time of retrieval, then we're more likely to remember it. So if we have a cue when we encode the information and then that same cue is present when we recall it, then we are more likely to remember the information. It can be down to the context. So we encode information in one context or environment, we're more likely to do it in the same environment. So this was your research study that when they had participants had to learn a list of words underwater and then recall on water, learn a list of words on land, recall on land, so the same environment. Or learn a list of words underwater and then on land, learn a list of words on land and underwater, recall underwater. They were different environments, and it's found that those that had encoded the information, so learnt in the same environment and had recalled the information in the same environment, had a better rate of the list of words. State dependent is when we encode information in the same frame of mind. So if we encode in one frame of mind and then recall when we're in the same state of mind, then we're more likely to remember the information. This research study was to do with the antihistamines. Participants either learned a list of words being on antihistamines and then recalled them when they were on antihistamines, so they were in the same state of mind, or they learnt the list of words without being on antihistamines and then recalled them without being on antihistamines, or they did it so they were in the opposite states. So learnt when on antihistamines, recalled when not on antihistamines, and vice versa. It's found that the participants that had the same state of mind in both scenarios were more likely to recall the information. Real life applications of this. So the cognitive interview gets participants to reinstate the context that they were in to try and help them retrieve the information. However, ESP is not testable and it forms a circular reason. So in experiments where a cue produces the successful recall of a word, it is assumed that that cue must have been present when it was encoded. And if a cue does not result in a successful recall of a word, then it's assumed that the cue was not there when it was encoded. But that's just the assumptions, which is no way to establish whether it was there or not there when it had been encoded. So eyewitness testimony. Eyewitness testimony is the evidence that's provided in court by a person who has witnessed a crime with a view of identifying the perpetrator. Now, misleading information can be broken down into leading questions. So a leading question is a question that either by the way that it is worded or the content that suggests that a desired answer is the correct answer. So they usually contain misleading information or they are closed questions. So for example, did you see the broken glass? Our research study for this is Loftus and Palmer. So they wanted to see the effects of leading questions on the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. They showed 45 students 7 films of different traffic accidents. So it was a lab experiment. After each film, they had a questionnaire to ask them about the accident, the incident. There was one critical question about how fast the cars were going when they hit each other. However, the verb was changed for different participants. So how fast was the car going when they smashed, collided, bumped, contacted? Okay. The group that had the word smashed estimated a higher speed, so above 41 miles per hour. Those that had the word contacted estimated a lower speed, so about 30 miles per hour. This led them to conclude that misleading and leading questions do affect the accuracy of eyewitness testimony, so it reduces the accuracy. Evaluation, again real life applications for the police force. So it's changed the way in which police officers would phrase their questions when interviewing eyewitnesses. We have that high internal validity of a lab experiment, so we can control our extraneous variables that could confound the result. However, because it is a lab experiment, it lacks mundane realism and ecological validity. So the task was quite artificial. So watching a film of an accident is very different to watching it in real life. So it lacks the stress that a real incident would have. It lacks population validity, so it was only conducted on students. So there is actually evidence that older people are less accurate when giving eyewitness testimony. And there may have been demand characteristics. So participants may have worked out that the leading questions is what they were intending to look at, and helpful participants could have skewed the results. Post-event discussion is another type of way in which we can have misleading information. So that is a conversation that happens between people that have witnessed a crime or other people or an interviewer after the crime has taken place, before they are interviewed. So we can have memory contamination, so that's when they discuss a crime and they mix the information together with their own memory, so they mix the information that's given by the other witness with their own. Or we can have memory conformity, so that's where we go along with the other person because we want to win the social approval, or because we believe that the other person was right or accurate in what they had seen. So this is Gabbett et al.'s study. So participants were studied in pairs. They each watched a video of the same crime, but they saw it from a different angle, from a different point of view. That meant that they couldn't see all the elements of the crime. After they'd witnessed or seen the video, they then were allowed to discuss the information before they completed a test of recall individually. So they found that 71% of participants mistakenly recalled aspects of the event that they hadn't seen, but they had picked up during the discussion. Whereas in the control group, so they'd watched the film but not had a discussion, there was no mistakes made. So this concluded that post-event discussion does reduce the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. Real-life applications. The police force can now use these findings during the investigation to try and prevent witnesses from discussing a crime before the interview. Good population validity, so two different populations, so university students and older adults were used, and there was little differences between them. Also, the use of a control group means that we can compare the information, so it wasn't just that the film was ambiguous and that affected the recall. It was down to the discussion between the participants. However, it lacks ecological validity, so watching a crime is very different to observing a crime in real life. Also, witnesses knew they were taking part in the experiment, so they could have paid more close attention to the details in a video clip. It's unlikely that when you are in everyday life that you will be aware that you will be a witness to a crime, so you won't pay that much attention. Anxiety. So anxiety is an unpleasant emotional state. It tends to be accompanied with physiological arousal, and we need to look at weapon focus. So that's when the weapon draws our attention, and we pay less attention to the peripheral details, so what they looked like, what was going on, and what the perpetrator or the criminal looked like. So we have some research into the negative effects of anxiety. So this is Johnson and Scott's study. So participants heard a conversation or an argument going on in an adjoining room. In condition 1, the man came into the room holding a pen and grease on his hands, so that was the low anxiety condition. In condition 2, the man came in with a paper knife and there was blood on his hands, so that was the high anxiety condition. They were then asked to identify the man from 50 photos. Okay, the findings showed that the accuracy rate for condition 1, the low anxiety, was higher, so 49% correctly identified the man from the photos, whereas condition 2, it reduced to 33%, so the high anxiety reduced the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. So they concluded that anxiety has a negative effects. It reduced the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. This has high ecological validity. Participants weren't aware that the study was staged, therefore it can be applied to outside the research setting and everyday crimes. It was lab-based, so we have high internal validity. So all other extraneous variables were controlled, so such as the lighting. So it wasn't that one condition had poor lighting, so they didn't see the man, and the other condition was in bright light, so they could successfully see him. However, there are ethical issues, so there could have been distressed and cause anxiety. There are demand characteristics in a lab experiment, so they might have been aware that they were taking part. And again, it could be that it was just the surprise element of seeing the knife, not that it was actually a weapon. So Pickle's study was in a hairdresser's, and they found that when there were surprise elements, so things that you wouldn't see in hairdressers, it caused identity, accuracy, recall to decrease. So when we see items that we would associate, so scissors, which could be a weapon, and a wallet, which we would expect to find, accuracy rate was relatively high. When we had a handgun, a weapon that high anxiety, but we wouldn't expect to find, that reduced. But also when we saw a raw chicken, it was a surprise element, it drew attention, so accuracy decreased. We can also look at the positive effects of anxiety. So 58 real witnesses to bank robberies in Sweden. They were either the victims, so the bank teller, or they'd been witness to the crime. So the victims were in the high anxiety group, the bystanders were in the low anxiety groups, and they were interviewed 4 to 15 months after the bank robberies. All of the witnesses showed good details for the robberies, but those that were in the most anxiety-induced conditions, so the victims, had the best recall. Led them to conclude that anxiety increases the reliability of eyewitness testimony. It was a natural experiment, was using a real crime, therefore has high ecological validity. We can apply it to other crimes. It was only done in Sweden, so police interview techniques could be different. We don't necessarily know. Can we apply it to different cultures? It may be unethical to get participants to remember a distressing crime, so are we failing to protect them from harm? Finally, the cognitive interview. So this is a police technique for interviewing eyewitnesses to encourage them to increase the recall and accuracy of their recall. And Fisher and Geiselman created it based on the review of memory literature, and they came up with 4 techniques. So this is the acronym COPE to help you remember. So C is the context. They have to reinstate the context. So think back to the absence of cues. They tried to put themselves back into the same environment to access that information. So how were they feeling? What was the weather like? What were they wearing? What were their thoughts? Change order. They may be asked to do an alternative timeline, so to reverse the order of the information. They're asked to change perspective, so they're asked to imagine what the crime would look like from a different person's point of view, so how it would appear to another witness, or how it might have looked from the criminal's eyes. They're also asked to report everything, regardless of how irrelevant or trivial that information may feel. So tell me everything that had happened. We have supporting evidence that the cognitive interview generates better detail. So older participants in particular recalled more detail than compared to the standard interview. So that was Wright and Holiday. The cognitive interview also produces an increased amount of correct information recalled compared to the standard interview. However, it takes a lot of time to do, and it takes more time than often is available to the police officers. Different police forces use different aspects of the cognitive interview. They don't necessarily use all 4 components, therefore it's difficult to investigate its effectiveness fully. That also, quantity versus quality. So they need to treat all information when it is the cognitive interview. So we've generated this massive amount of information, but actually is it generally of a high quality? So it doesn't necessarily generate accuracy. So it's found that 61% of the incorrect information recalled and 81% of correct information recalled when the CI is compared to a standard interview. So it doesn't necessarily increase the accuracy of eyewitness testimony.